She wrapped her only blanket around a dying stranger on the coldest night of the year, never once imagining that the man shaking in her arms was worth more than $40 billion, and that, within 3 weeks, that single act of kindness would either save her life or end it. Emma Callahan was 28 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that kindness rarely pays the bills. She worked the overnight shift at Marchetti's Diner on the south side of Chicago, refilling coffee cups for truckers and insomniacs from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. And then she went home to care for her mother, whose lungs had been failing for 2 years. Emma's father was gone. Her savings were gone too, most of it swallowed by hospital bills that never seemed to stop arriving. She had exactly $211 in her checking account, and rent was due in 6 days. That January, Chicago was in the grip of a cold snap so brutal that the news anchors kept calling it historic. The kind of cold that turned exposed skin to frostbite in under 20 minutes. Emma remembered every second of that walk home, because it was the night everything changed. She was cutting through the alley behind the diner, the one she always used because it shaved 10 minutes off her walk, when she saw him. A man, slumped against a dumpster, barely moving, his lips a shade of blue she had only ever seen in textbooks. His clothes were thin, wrong for the weather, like he had never expected to be out in it. Most people who passed that alley kept their heads down and walked faster. Emma had done the same thing, more times than she liked to admit. But something about this man stopped her cold. "Hey," she said, crouching down, her breath fogging in the freezing air. "Hey, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and he mumbled something she couldn't make out. His skin was ice. Emma knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from watching her mother struggle to breathe for 2 years, that this man would not survive another hour outside. She thought about calling an ambulance. She almost did, but she also knew what happened to men like this in city hospitals, when they showed up with no insurance card and no ID, how fast they got pushed back out into the cold once they were stable enough to stand. So Emma did something that her sister would later call the most reckless decision of her entire life. She took him home. It took everything she had to get him up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. His arms slung over her shoulder, his feet barely cooperating. Her mother, half asleep on the couch, sat up in alarm when the door banged open. "Emma?" "What in God's name?" "He was freezing to death, Mama. I couldn't just leave him there." Her mother didn't argue. She had raised Emma to have exactly this kind of heart, even if it terrified her sometimes. Together, they got the stranger onto the fold-out couch, piled every blanket in the apartment on top of him, and Emma sat beside him through the night, watching his chest rise and fall, willing it to keep happening. By morning, his color had returned. He opened his eyes, and for the first time, really looked at her. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in a while. "My apartment. You were freezing outside Marchetti's Diner. I couldn't leave you there." He stared at her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that Emma couldn't quite name. Not confusion, something closer to disbelief. "You don't even know me," he said, quietly. "No," Emma admitted. "But you would have died. That was enough of a reason for me." He gave her a name that morning. Daniel. Just Daniel, no last name offered, and Emma, raised to respect boundaries, didn't push for one. He said he'd lost his job, lost his apartment, lost track of how long he'd been on the street. He was vague about the details in a way that struck Emma as strange. But she chalked it up to shame. People didn't always want to talk about how far they'd fallen. What Emma didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the man sleeping on her pull-out couch was Julian Cross, the founder and chairman of Cross Dynamics, a technology and infrastructure empire that spanned 6 continents, a man whose net worth had made headlines for being higher than the GDP of several small nations. 3 weeks earlier, Julian Cross had been declared missing after his private plane went down over Lake Michigan during a storm. The wreckage had been found. His body had not. The financial world was in chaos. His company's stock had cratered, and a very expensive, very public memorial service had already been planned for the following month. Julian was very much alive. He had survived the crash by a miracle he still didn't fully understand, had swum to a frigid shoreline half-conscious, and had spent the following weeks in a state of shock, disoriented, moving through the city like a ghost, terrified to reveal who he was. Because the crash, he was almost certain, had not been an accident. He said nothing of this to Emma, not yet. The days that followed were unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. Daniel, as she knew him, was quiet, watchful, and strangely formal in the way he spoke, like a man who had spent his whole life choosing his words with precision. He didn't know how to work the microwave. He didn't know the price of a gallon of milk. Little things that should have raised alarm bells instead struck Emma as endearing. Evidence of a man who'd simply had a hard road and forgotten the small comforts of normal life. He started helping around the apartment in ways that surprised her. He fixed the leaking faucet in the bathroom with parts he somehow acquired from a hardware store 2 blocks away. Paying with cash Emma hadn't given him, though she was too tired and too grateful to ask where it came from. He sat with her mother in the evenings, listening to her stories about Emma as a little girl. And Emma noticed, with a tightness in her chest she didn't want to examine too closely, that her mother laughed more in that first week than she had in months. "You're good with her," Emma said one night, after her mother had gone to bed. "She reminds me of someone," Daniel said. "Someone I lost touch with a long time ago." "Your mother?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something like that." There was a wall around him. Emma could feel it, something guarded and careful. And she told herself it wasn't her business to tear it down. But she found herself wanting to anyway. She found herself thinking about him during her shifts at the diner, wondering if he'd eaten, if he was warm enough, if the sadness she sometimes caught in his eyes when he thought no one was looking would ever lift. It was on the 11th day that everything cracked open. Emma came home from her shift to find Daniel standing frozen in front of the small television in the living room. The color drained from his face. On the screen was a news segment, a photograph of a distinguished man in an expensive suit. The words, "Billionaire, Julian Cross, presumed dead," scrolling beneath his face. Older in the photo. Better dressed, cleanly shaven, but unmistakably him. Emma's grocery bag slipped from her hand. She started, and couldn't finish the sentence. Julian turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd found him in that alley, he looked genuinely afraid. Not of the cold, not of hunger, but of her reaction. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I didn't know how." "I wasn't lying to hurt you," Julian said, and he crossed the room to stand in front of her, closer than he'd ever stood before. "Someone tried to kill me, Emma. My plane didn't crash because of a storm. I've spent 3 weeks trying to figure out who I can trust, because the people closest to me, the people who were supposed to protect my company, my family, may be the ones who wanted me dead. And in 3 weeks of being invisible, of being nobody, you were the only person on this earth who looked at a dying man in an alley and saw somebody worth saving. Not my name, not my money, just me." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Emma could hear her own heartbeat. "Who would want you dead?" she finally asked. Julian's jaw tightened. "My son-in-law, Marcus Whitfield. He married my daughter Sophia 4 years ago, and in the last year he's maneuvered himself onto my board, built alliances with 3 other directors, and started quietly moving assets in ways that only make sense if he expected me not to be around to notice. I found out 2 days before the crash. I didn't tell anyone. I think that's exactly why the crash happened. Emma sat down slowly on the arm of the couch, the enormity of it settling over her. So, what happens now? Now, Julian said. I have to decide whether to stay dead or come back and fight for everything I built, knowing the people I trusted most were the ones trying to bury me. For the next several days, Emma watched a different man emerge from the quiet, broken stranger she'd carried up 3 flights of stairs. Julian began making calls from a burner phone he'd bought with cash, speaking in clipped, careful sentences to a small handful of people he still believed he could trust. A longtime attorney, a former head of security, who'd retired 2 years earlier, under circumstances Julian now suspected weren't accidental either. Emma listened to fragments of these conversations, understanding pieces of a puzzle that was far larger and far darker than she'd ever imagined touching her small life. Then came the night the black SUV parked outside her building. Emma spotted it first, through the gap in the curtains, sitting at the curb with its engine running despite the freezing temperatures, exactly the kind of stillness that didn't belong on her block. "Julian!" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's a car outside. It's been there for 20 minutes. He crossed to the window, and Emma watched his whole body go rigid. "That's one of Marcus's security contractors," he said. "They found me." What happened over the next 40 minutes would replay in Emma's mind for years afterward. The pounding on the door that never came, because Julian's retired head of security, a broad, silent man named Reyes, arrived first with 2 off-duty police officers. Julian had quietly hired the day before as a precaution. The shouting in the stairwell, the sight of 2 men in dark jackets being walked out in handcuffs while neighbors peered through cracked doors. Julian stood in the hallway that night, no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be Daniel from nowhere, and made one final phone call. This one not to his lawyer, but to a national news desk. "This is Julian Cross," he said, his voice steady for the first time in 3 weeks. "I'm not dead, and I have quite a lot to say." The story broke by morning, and it broke everywhere. Julian Cross alive. The headlines screamed. Attempted corporate cup exposed. Within 72 hours, Marcus Whitfield was under federal investigation for conspiracy, securities fraud, and attempted murder. His carefully built alliances collapsing as 3 board members scrambled to distance themselves and cooperate with investigators to save their own skins. Julian's daughter, Sophia, devastated and furious, filed for divorce the same week, standing publicly at her father's side in a press conference that dominated national news for days. And through all of it, cameras hungry for every detail of the story. Reporters camped outside a modest apartment building on the south side of Chicago, desperate to speak with the waitress who had unknowingly sheltered the richest man in the country. Emma turned down every interview. "I didn't do it for the story," she told Julian, the 2 of them sitting on that same worn pull-out couch 3 weeks later, the chaos finally beginning to settle. "I did it because you were a person freezing to death. That's all it ever was." "I know," Julian said. "That's exactly why I need you to understand something. Everything you did before you knew my name was worth anything. Before you knew I could offer you a single thing in return. Emma, in 30 years of building an empire, you are the only person who has ever given me something and wanted absolutely nothing back." He reached into his coat pocket, and for a moment, Emma braced herself for a check, a business card. Some gesture wrapped in money that would somehow cheapen everything that had happened between them. Instead, he pulled out a small, worn photograph, one he'd apparently kept folded in his wallet even through the crash, even through 3 weeks of homelessness. It was a picture of his own mother, taken decades earlier, standing outside a rundown apartment building not unlike Emma's, before Julian Cross had built anything at all. "She raised me with nothing," he said quietly, "and somewhere along the way, becoming everything, I forgot what. nothing, and everything that matters within it actually looks like. You reminded me. Emma's mother recovered from her illness faster than any doctor expected, in no small part because Julian quietly ensured she received the finest specialists in the country, framing it, always, as gratitude rather than charity, because he understood, better than anyone, the difference between the two. Marchetti's diner got a new roof and a full renovation, an anonymous gift Emma didn't learn the source of for months, and a foundation was launched within the year, the Cross Second Chance Initiative, funding shelters and medical care for the homeless in cities across the country, staffed in its Chicago office by a woman who once refilled coffee cups on the overnight shift, and still, to this day, insists on visiting every shelter herself, because she never forgot what it looked like to see a person the world had stopped looking at. Julian Cross rebuilt his company from the ground up, this time with a board he trusted and a public that adored him, for reasons that had nothing to do with his balance sheet. But the story people told most, the one that outlasted every headline about corporate coups and federal indictments, was the simple one, about a cold January night, an alley behind a diner, and a woman who chose to see a human being where everyone else had chosen to look away. They married 18 months later, in a small ceremony that made no headlines at all, because Emma had asked for exactly one thing, that no cameras be allowed inside. Julian gave her that, the same way she'd once given him warmth and shelter and a blanket with nothing expected in return. Because, in the end, the richest man in the world had already learned the one lesson his fortune could never teach him on its own, that the truest wealth anyone could ever hold wasn't measured in the size of an empire, but in the size of a heart willing to open a door to a stranger on the coldest night of the year and ask for nothing in return.